movie makes me feel like a grumpy old man. Directed by Dorian Weiszimmer, we are talking Edgelord, the movie. Actually, it's actually called Chicago Rot, but it may as well be called I'm So Edgy, or Edgelords Are Here, or something along the lines of that. Let's discuss. What do we think of this low-budget, independent, gory science fiction movie? Okay. What is the story? Well, that's the million-dollar question with this one, I'll be telling you. It vaguely focuses on this guy who is known as the Ghoul, and he is a vigilante who has been imprisoned for the last 10 years, and he went on his vigilante crusade because of the murder of his mother some years before, and he's been in prison for the last 10 years and is now released and immediately kind of gets in kind of trouble again and is pursued by both the police and it appears some type of criminal element. So far it sounds pretty kind of like straightforward, but then we have this weird kind of science fiction paranormal element, in particular in the kind of the last act of the movie. Not to mention it has a weird kind of fetish vibe going throughout it, and a weird incoherent narrative that kind of is getting pulled from pillar to post. Okay, let's go into a bit more detail. What do I think that works in this movie? I'm going to somewhat take my grumpy old man hat off and try and be positive about some of the things I do think legitimately work in this movie. It is a lower budget movie, but I've got to say, from a creative standpoint, this one, it has bags of creativity. And it's almost, I don't want to call it an art house movie, because it certainly is, it's not what I would consider classically an art house film, and it's certainly lots of kind of creativity on display here. Weird kind of surreal kind of sequences. It veers from almost like Batman and Robin style visuals into kind of a gritty crime drama, into weird kind of like gladiatorial combats with kind of like mythic beasts and things, to weird kind of kinky Pulp Fiction kind of style gimp characters. It's all in here, and it kind of just veers from one thing to another. So I will say, on a visual standpoint only, it is a very interesting movie with a kind of a diverse kind of mixture of kind of styles and elements that are on screen, and it certainly has a stylistic element to it. Now there is a lot of kind of violence on display here, and some of it is pretty graphic. For example, we see one guy get impaled through, completely through his body, and we actually see the kind of the knife travelling through his intestines, cutting, his intestinal tubes along the way. And then the same guy's impaled with a kind of a large dildo as well, things like this. So there's a lot of kind of like explicit gore. I mean, it's not all the way through. It's not like Hotel Inferno or anything like that, but there are elements of quite strong gore here and there. And as I said, it has this weird kind of kinky vibe to it as well. So those of you who are into the S&M scene, you may get a kick out of this one, because it definitely feels like it's kind of like somewhat a preaching to the perverted, you might say, with lots of kind of sequences that have this weird kind of like S&M kind of kinky vibe here. Our main kind of character, I have to say, is he looks like he should have been playing in the Misfits. He kind of looks like he'd be right at home up there with Glenn Danzig and Doyle and Ethel. It's visually, I would say, at least very kind of arresting, and kind of like, and I will give it props for kind of creativity. And I also have to say, some of the effects work here is interesting. Some of it's on the cheesy side, I feel somewhat deliberately so. Like I said, we have the last act of this movie, it goes real kind of like weird. And the visuals really did remind me of like Mr. Freeze from Batman and Robin and things like that. But some of the kind of the gore effects I think are quite effective. Some of the prosthetics I think are quite effective. And for such a kind of clearly a low budget independent movie, even some of the performances weren't too bad, I will say. Again, they're somewhat kind of stylized. There's lots of shouting and caricatures, but it's done in a stylistic way, which I kind of appreciated. But let me just transition to what doesn't work here, because this is one of these films, and this is where I'm going to put my grumpy old man hat firmly back on again, that the narrative is second to the visuals, because it's all about that kind of, that visual kind of like edgy kind of sheen that this movie wants to have. And I think any real attempt at having a, you know, a cohesive narrative is just along for the ride, thrown out the window, and if it happens to kind of make sense, then great. I mean, there is the kind of the bare bones of a story, but there's so much kind of like extra kind of baggage on this movie, which it tries to kind of hang on and add to it. It just feels like a confusing mess with kind of transitions going from flashbacks to dream sequences without really kind of knowing where you are and what the character's actually supposed to be doing. And sometimes even some of the kind of like the stylistic choices like camera angle is confusing to see which kind of characters you're actually going to be focusing on. But the narrative is kind of all over the place. Characters' motivations don't really seem to make any kind of sense, and are kind of like, again, just seem to vary wildly from one person to another in regards to how kind of seriously they might be taking a particular kind of a plot point and things like that. I think the movie, I'll be honest with you, I feel like it kind of runs out of steam. This would be like a great kind of music video, maybe for the Misfits, there you go. But as a story, it fails to engage, because it's much as the kind of like the flashy, edgy visuals kind of, you know, are somewhat impressive in their own right. When you're carrying a featured story, you know, unless we have an interesting narrative, or even a semi-interesting narrative, you know, it kind of like, it doesn't really, you know, follow us a kind of a real kind of story here, or any type of thing you can really grasp onto. Things just happen, like our main character takes a point-blank kind of like gunshot right to the chest, and it seems to barely faze him, but we don't know why. You know, it just doesn't. You know, he said, oh yeah, he kind of eats the flesh of his victims and puts them on him. And why? It just, you know, it's kind of, it doesn't really do a good enough job here of kind of having any type of sense, to be honest. Now, it might be one of these films that go, well, you know, if we don't want to spoon feed you everything, some of this you've got to kind of you know, figure out for yourself. But the film is a visual narrative, and it's fine if it wants to kind of not be too explicit about certain, because plenty of films do that. But I feel you have to have to have compelling writing and be a good storyteller to pull that off. Whereas this one is not. So, should you watch this movie? I feel this is a really kind of grimy grindhouse type movie. If you like this kind of like gutter kind of horror, stylistic choices, or you're interested in kind of like fetish horror is the best way I would kind of describe this, then you may want to check it out for the visuals. But don't be expecting to be interested in this compelling narrative with interesting, well-drawn characters and great performances, because none of that is there. It's just like let's have some visual spectacle and everything else is secondary. As such, hard to rate this movie. It's definitely a below average film for me. I'll give it a 4 out of 10, and I do think the visuals are relatively strong. I feel like I'm being generous with that one, if I'm honest with you, but I will give credit where credit is due. Visually and aesthetically, it is interesting, but I can't give it an above average or even an average mark, because the narrative here is just all over the place. 4 out of 10, have you seen it? What did you think? Leave me a comment and I shall look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.